Welcome to Access Europe for April 2025. Spring has finally arrived and we've got beautiful, warm, sunny weather here. So we're all feeling very smiley, which is perfect for our presenter. Anders Ebro from Denmark, superstar, former MVP, and also was a previous organizer of an earlier incarnation of Access Europe about 10 years ago, which I didn't realize until after I'd started this batch of sessions here. Anders is an excellent speaker, and I saw him presenting this topic to the UK Access User Group last November in Oxford, and it was so well received that I asked him if he could repeat it and update it and give it to Access Europe, which he's doing today. After the session, there will be both a PowerPoint and also the Access database that he's going to be presenting in this session. Anders, are you ready to take over and give us more detail about yourself and to lead the presentation?
Yeah, I will start sharing my screen then. Let's see. Now I don't have a PowerPoint presentation because I've just made a presentation within Access.
Even easier.
That means I have less jumping back and forth to do. So today's topic is VBA Classes 101, and as Colin has already said, it's been presented by Anders Ebro. I am a principal consultant at a company called Exacto from Denmark. I'm sort of a jack of all trades, software architect or core framework designer, and I do both client projects, but also spend quite a bit of time evolving our internal framework and our internal developer tools. I was a Microsoft MVP from 2014 till 2023 until I gave that up. I've already said this. I'd say just about us as a company, we market ourselves to Excel users and then sell them on database solutions that actually run in Excel. I don't do that much Access anymore. I think probably 70% of my work is in SQL Server, another 20% in Excel, and just a smidgen in Access these days. So the session overview for today, from zero to hero in less than an hour. It's a hands-on walkthrough of class creation and usage. I want to talk about what they can offer us as developers, and I'll give you a live demonstration of creating and using a class. I'd prefer if people hold their questions until the end, but if you feel there's something that's kind of disturbing or you feel I left something out, do feel free to interrupt. But usually I have it in a certain way and I'll cover it when I get to it. I'm also more than happy to answer any questions over an email later. So just a quick question, which does work better in a classroom, but how many in here have created their own class? You just type it in the chat. I think that makes most sense. And how many of you use classes in their everyday work? Let's see if I can get the chat up here. Okay, so quite a good bit of people have used classes. That's good to see. But let's see if we can take it a step further. Before we get into the details, I figure I'd touch base on why we, as Access developers, probably see less of a use for classes than other coders might. As Access developers, we are used to interacting with data through forms, and although most people don't think about it that often, forms are kind of a class in itself. And I'm not just talking about the generic form class, but when you create a class for handling persons, that kind of resembles in many ways how you might create a person class. You have properties on that form, or you have methods on that form that could also have been in a class, but now we have a form that kind of encapsulates that logic for us. We also have record sets that make, which is also something you might use a class for, to interact between your user screen and the data storage. But for that, we have the record sets, and they're directly bound to the form anyway, so it's just so much simpler. But there's a lot of things we can still do with classes, even as Access developers. And so one of the things I was asked is when we should use a class. And kind of the same as when we look at code. Should this be separated into its own procedure? The same kind of things that rule it, that if you notice a pattern, if you notice you're copy pasting something, that might be a good reason to start using a class. So what is a class? It's a blueprint or definition for an object. It can hold variables and it can have properties which are not exactly the same as variables, although they might seem similar at a glance. It can have methods and it can have events, but it can also listen for events. And of course, with VBA, it supports IntelliSense. So there's a lot of class tutorials that I've seen online for VBA or for Access that don't really resonate with us as Access developers. And as I just said, like class person, you might see a demo of someone making a class and they've made class person, and you're like, well, I'd just do that with a form. And as soon as you look at that example and it doesn't really resonate with you, you start losing interest. So as I was preparing this presentation, I wanted to make something that was useful and demonstrate classes at the same time. So I wanted to make a calendar class. I think most of you are familiar with trying to use or even make some sort of date picker function. But before we get into the class, let's just kind of start with illustrating the opposite of using a class. So let's take a look at how it might look, a calendar form, if we don't have a class for it. It's a pretty simple form. And if we take a look at it, the code here. This is kind of an example of really bad coding. You have a text box, one click, does something, and then you copy paste that same code into text box 2, text box 3, text box 4. You might have a mouse over or mouse move event you want to do. And again, code is copy pasted and just slightly modified that if you move over the first text box, it colors that text box blue, the other one's white. And of course, the second one is just flipped a bit. One of the things that you might notice here, of course, you could replace this with a function and you could call that function from your text box, but you'd still end up with 40 text box click events, which isn't great code. And one of the things I really realized while working with this is if you're trying to test this and you actually need to test all of the buttons, because as soon as you have that copy pasted code, you can't actually be sure that each and every button is doing the same and working the same because they have their own code. So by using a class for each of these dates, we can end up with code that is both simpler to maintain. I mean, imagine we want to make a change, you have to go and make 40 changes. It's much simpler if we have a class. We can modify that code in one place, and we only have one place to test it. Of course, you should always still, test the edge cases like the first date in the month and the last day in the month, something like that. So most of you might have seen something like that calendar class before, probably a bit smarter than that, but let's try to do it in a functional way and let's try to do it the classy way. I've prepared another sample form, this form calendar. It starts really simple. It has 2 drop-downs, 2 buttons, and a bunch of text box controls beneath the surface. The buttons have already been set up to simply navigate to months, and the code so far is super simple. You can see if we look at it in design view, we have these text boxes prepared for our our code. So our first custom class will be a class for each date that we want to display. And we want our class to support showing all of the dates in all of the weeks of a month. We want it to show mouse clicking, and we want it to have some sort of highlighting. Now, what do I mean when I say show all dates in all weeks of a month? Well, what I mean, if you take a look at this calendar class, we can see we're missing the dates here at the end. And we might be missing dates from the beginning as well. And I wanted to show those dates as well. So that's what I want my class to be able to do. So let's try to jump into VBA and create our first class. So for those that don't know, simple right click, insert class module. We will call this class DateDisplay. And we start by adding our variables. Right now, this is completely empty. So I'll just copy and paste some variables in. We have our parent, which is a reference to the calendar form. We have a number, a date, a record set, and a text box. So we need to initialize our class in some way. We need to have it set up so that each of our class knows which date it is supposed to represent. So let's jump into our form calendar. And as you can see, it just has the 2 subs for navigating the months. I will add, and sorry for this, the screen flickering, I'll add to the form load, I'll call Initialize. I prefer to make it this way, especially if you have more things you want to have happen in the form load. Then Initialize is what I use to set up the dates. And I'll just copy paste in or Initialize. So it's really simple. We loop through the numbers from 1 to 42. You might think, why am I not looping from 1 to 31? Well, because you can have up to 6 weeks in a month. And to support all of those dates, we need from 1 to 42. Behind the scenes, I also have a DateDimension table. I'll just briefly show that. So simply has a date, it has the weekday number, it has a textual representation of a weekday text, notices whether it's a weekend, has what's the week number of the month, what's the day in the month, the day in the year, and the year number. So that kind of, I can use these date tables for all sorts of fancy querying. I love using date tables. But for this case, what we simply do is we open our record set, the date dimension, and from the numbers from 1 to 42, we set a text box so that our first one will be the text box 01, 02, so on and so forth. Get a reference to that text box on the form, the pre-created text boxes. I'll create a new class DateDisplay, and for that class DateDisplay, I'm calling an Initialize. Of course, I haven't written this Initialize for the DateDisplay yet. So let's jump over to our DateDisplay and write our Initialize. Again, I'll just copy paste it in, saves us some time. So the Initialize for the class receives the text box, the number, and the record set. Of course, this doesn't do much at the moment. It's just saving each of these variables into the class level variables. And you can see I use the prefix of saying all of the member variables have a M in front of them. The exception is the parent. Prefer to use this notation. Of course, nothing much has happened yet. We still can't see any dates in the form because I haven't done anything with the text box. But I should be able to open the form if I wanted to. Now, we need each DateDisplay object to know what month it is and what day it should display. But rather than looping from the parent, I want to use events. So first, we define our own event in the calendar, and we define it with a parameter. So I'll take this public event month change, and that is in the calendar itself. Should be up at the top. Public event month change, month ID as long. And for those wondering, month ID, I use the syntax of having the year and then the month afterwards. And if it's month 1, it will be 01. So this would be January of 2022. So inside our date display, we need to listen to this custom event we just added. So if we jump into date display, I can now say that I want this parent to listen to the events. So I'll say with events, telling VBA that we want this object to be able to listen. And you can see now I have parent here. I didn't before. I can just show that if I don't have the parent, then it's just blank. But if I say with events, we get this in our dropdown. And we can see what events my form calendar is exposing. It just has our month change event. But let's, again, cheating a bit, copy and pasting in some code here. And let's briefly run through what it does. Basically, I get in what's the month ID, and I move my record set. As you might recall, as when this was initialized, it was passed in a record set. So keep that in memory. I navigate to, first, I navigate to the month. And so that might be, if we take a look at another calendar form here, you can see for April, that might be the first in that month would be a Tuesday. But that's not the first date I want to display, because I wanted to include this one. So after doing my first navigate to the month, I do a second navigate and say move backwards until you find the record that is the first day in the month. Then I say I want to, for the text box, I want that to display what's the day in the month. And I'm storing the actual date within a variable so I can use it later. And the last part here is something about controlling whether a text box is visible. And I need this because sometimes you have 5 weeks in a month, sometimes you have 6 weeks. So I need to control whether or not that last week should show, and I won't go into the logic of this. Finally, I want to say if the date we're displaying, if the date we're currently looking at is not the same as the month ID, that would be, in the case of April, that would be the 31st of March, or the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of May. For those dates, it's not the same month ID, and then I want to color it. I've predefined a colors enum with some stored colors. I love using enums because that will allow me to, instead of writing the numbers out, it gives me one place to change it if I decide that I want some other colors, and it also means that I get something I can call something meaningful, so I can remember that this is the font color I want to use for other months. So let's try to see if it's working now and see what we get if we open it up. Just saving my records. Okay, so nothing happened right now. It's because I forgot something. I forgot to raise the event. So if I jump into my calendar and say, well, as soon as you're done loading, I can either put it here, raise event, month change, and I need to pass in the month ID. So I'll take that month ID from the combo box. So let's try to see it now. And so something I forgot. Yes, I know what I forgot. What I forgot was that I need to keep these variables in scope that I set up. I've set up my class date displays, but as soon as my code is done running, all of these are forgotten about. They're out of scope. So I need to create a variable to store them in. So I'll create a collection up here, and down here I will add them to my collection. And of course, I also need to initialize my collection. So since this variable is at the form level, it will always, or this variable is at the form level, it will always be in scope for my form. So they will no longer, these variables will no longer fall out of scope when the initialize is done running. So we should now have our form display. As you can see, we have our controls showing up here, and they are all in gray. And I know I changed something just before this presentation, but I'll see if I can find it out later, since that's just the coloring that's not working. So if we just go back into our form, I want to add this raise event to another location as well, because as you might have noticed, when I displayed here and I navigated, nothing happened. It didn't update. So when I click the month next, I'll also call the raise event. And down here, I'll also call the raise event. So now we should see it update when we switch the month. Now I remember. Sorry, it's been a while since I made this presentation. I need, of course, to create the correct month ID. And right now, the combo box for months was, the value of that was 1 to 12. So I need to combine it with the year. So now combining it with the year in all places where I call it, we should get the correct display. Now you can see in dark black all of the dates of that month. And as I click, it updates, and you can see how the, shall we say, outer or border dates of the week are updated in light gray. You can also see how, as we switch to the month of June, we get an extra week in our date display. Now, at this point, I want to say something about the fundamental difference between using RaiseEvent versus using the Colin code to set variables. And I want to compare it to, let's imagine there was a fire in the room. If you're sitting in a big room and you want to respond to that fire, now if you're doing it in a procedural or sequential fashion, what you do is basically for each person in the room, you tell them to get out of the room, there's a fire. Now that works, but the problem is that relies on me having all of the information. It relies on me telling each of the persons to do something. It relies again on me knowing and seeing all of the persons in the room. What if someone's hiding behind the desk or whatever? In an event-driven architecture, instead what happens is that I just shout fire, and I don't individually tell each of you, but you are listening for that event. You're listening for something happening. Each of you have your own listeners set up, and I leave it up to you to listen for the event, and I leave it up to you to respond to how you want to react to the event that there's a fire. Are you climbing out the door, or are you climbing out the window, or getting a fire extinguisher, all of that? I don't need to know who's in the room. I don't need to know how you will react. I just announce the event. And that's kind of how I see RaiseEvent, is me announcing something is happening. It also means that each of the individual events might, or each of you might error out, but it shouldn't affect the other people in the room from doing what you want to do in response to the fire. So let's try to move on. I want to add some mouse action. I want to make it easier for the user to see where the mouse is. So I want to add a second event, a mouseover event. And as you might recall from the first calendar class, we also had a bit of highlighting there, our first calendar form, but it was a very kludgy way of doing it. So let's just go back and do a broadcast of this new event. So I want to have here public event mouseover. And in our class DateDisplay, in our Initialize, I'm going to add some events to the text box. On mouse move equal event procedure. This is basically telling Access to announce the event. When you put event procedures, it's kind of similar to saying do a raise event. If you don't add this, then I can't listen to the event. And I also want to have the same for on click, since we'll be using that later. Now I also need our code for each class DateDisplay to listen to the events of the text box. So I need to go up here again and say WithEvents, because I want to do something with my text box. And in our calendar, I want to expand a bit on this mouse over, and I'll say O as object. So again, passing something along with the event. And I also want to add a property to my class, my calendar. I want to say private. I want to have an object that I store what is the mouse currently over. This was my variable. Now I'll add a property for setting and getting it. I'm going to add a public property get mouse over. Set mouse over equal my form variable. And I want to have a set as well. Receiving the object and setting the mouse over control. Now, currently, these properties would be, they don't do anything yet, especially or something to make me realize why I should be using a property instead of just defining this as a public object. But this is where we do that change in having a property versus just a variable, because when I set this mouse over, that means I also want to do something. I want to raise an event. I want to raise my mouse over event passing in the object. And I'll expand a bit on this because I'll say if O is M mouse over, then I don't want to do anything because the object we're passing in is already the same object as the one I have stored. And else, then set it to the new variable and raise that event. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with using is, but it's kind of similar to equal. It's just something you use for objects. So let's jump into our class DateDisplay. And as you can see, and I also have my M text up here. And currently you're seeing all of the events that a text box supports, though only some of them will fire the ones that I've set to have an event procedure. So let's do the mouse move, just clean up this. So set parent. And as you might recall, the parent was set up here to be the form calendar. Set parent dot mouseover equal me. So I'm actually not passing in the specific text box. I'm passing in the DateDisplay class to my parent mouseover, which will then do a raise event. So whenever I move over the text box, I'm letting the parent know where the mouse currently is. I want to make a bit more because I also want to make sure that the detail section of the parent form has the code as well, so that if I move over the detail section, that the highlighting will reflect that. So let's jump in here and say in the detail mouse move, I basically just clear the mouse over event. And again, you can see rather than calling code, rather than here having code that will loop through all of my controls doing the coloring, I'm simply letting the form know that the mouse over has changed, and then let that decide to raise an event, and then let the classes themselves respond to listening to this event and what they want to do with it. The last step is that we need to modify our class DateDisplay with our listener. So we have our parent, and you can see we now have a second event. Initially, we only had that month change event, but now we also have the mouse over event. And again, I'll just copy some code in. So if the mouse over control is nothing, it's blank. That means that it was set back to nothing. The mouse moves over. Could be the detailed section. We don't really care. We're just saying that, well, the mouse is currently over nothing. And then I'll modify the back color of my text box. If the mouse over control is actually myself, then I want to set the text color to my mouse over back color. Finally, I do a bit of a check. I use this type of mouse over control is class DateDisplay. So why do I do this? Because I receive something as an object. So I can't be sure what properties or methods it might support. So I use this defensive bit of coding to say I want to verify that it is a class DateDisplay. I mean, I could have modified the mouse over to do other stuff as well. But if it is a class DateDisplay, then I know it will support a number property, which of course I haven't added yet. So let's just go and add a number property to a class DateDisplay. Private property get no as long no equals to m no. Now you'll see before I added, when I did the other property, I had both a get and a set. Now in this case, I only want to have a get. The number is set when you initialize it, and once that's initialized, it doesn't make sense to change the number. So I don't want to have a write procedure, a set procedure for this property. I only want to have the get. So let's see if this compiles. It's because I used to do it like this, passing in control. And let's just do some camel casing on this. So now it's compiles. Let's save it and see if it can run. Okay, it's running. Let's see what happens when we put the mouse over. Crashes. So I have my mouse over control.number, and it says this wasn't supported. Oh, of course, because I accidentally declared it as private. So let's go make it public and try again. So now I get this fancy highlighting, and you might wonder how is that done? Well, here we're looking at the mouse over control, the number. So that would be the number of the text box, like 1 to 42. And then basically all of this is about trying to figure out if we are next to the control, if we are the actual control, if we are near the border. So that's just a bit of math to kind of say, well, I want the primary control to be this dark green, but I also want all of the neighbor controls to be highlighted. And of course, I don't want it to crash if I'm near borders. Each of these controls, actually all 42 of these controls are listening into the event and deciding whether they should change the color. And just a small note more, might notice that here, if the mouse over control is nothing, then I want my text box to be white. Now I could just have done it like this, but there's a performance improvement by not modifying the property unless you need to. And this is probably because when I set the back color, Access is doing a lot of work. When I set the back color, Access is doing a lot of work, and that is killing my performance, especially when I don't need to do it. I would argue that if the Access code was smarter, it would say, well, if the new back color is the same as the old back color, then don't do a lot of work. But presumably it does this work anyway, and we can save it from doing the work by not modifying the property unless we really need to. Okay, so we've seen it displayed, we've seen it demonstrated. Now, if we just take it a few steps further, we can get something that looks like this. I've added, so just backtrack and see. I seem to be missing the mouse click. Maybe I never actually coded that. I'm jumping forward to the final solution where I've basically been doing more of the same. But you might notice that up here, you can see the day of the week. And I've also added some coloring to that. So you can see how that changes to emphasize what's the day of the week. You can see I've also added the current date to be this dark gray. And if I click, I can now, so this is the date I have selected. Now let's take a look at how this calendar might work. And now we've just coded the calendar. We can see it highlight. We can see we can select the date. So let's say we have a production form here. We might even also have a sales form that we want to show. Let's say we open up our calendar and we want to filter. I need the final one. As I did it in the wrong order, sorry. I have my calendar form open. I also open my production and my sales. Now, each of these forms is listening to the calendar. And let's see if we can, I probably need to go back to 2024 because that's the year I produced it. And that's where I have the sample data. As I click in my calendar form, you can see both of these forms will update to show any available records. And again, one of the beauty of using these RaiseEvents is that the calendar doesn't need to know what other events or what other code to execute. We have an event called dateSelected, and we'll fire this event whenever I select a date. That makes sense. And my production form is listening into the events of the calendar. And I'm saying, well, whenever I open my production form, if the calendar is loaded, then listen into those events. This means that if I close one of these forms, the code is still working because the calendar form doesn't need to know if any of my other subforms are open, it's just raising the event and saying, well, if anyone cares, the date selected changed. If you don't care, that's fine as well. But the calendar form shouldn't need to know that the production form is open or the sales form is open. Again, we can do this in a embedded fashion as well. This is basically the same form. We have our production form and the sales form. It's the same forms, they're just open as subforms now. And again, they are listening into the events, and we'll have to go back to 24 to get some actual data. But I didn't actually change anything. The production form, as I demonstrated earlier, saying, well, if the form is loaded, then set a reference. If the embed form is loaded, then set a reference. So it's obvious that my production form needs to know if the calendar is available and whether to listen to it. But by using events rather than having form 1 call code in form 2, that puts up a dependency. Instead, I'm saying that I'm listening to the events of that form. It also means that if I close the calendar form, let's see, if I had the calendar form open first and then open my production form is still going to work, even though I closed the calendar form. Now there's just nothing to listen to, but it's still going to work. I can still navigate, I can still do my editing. So using events rather than having form 1 call something on form 2 is a more secure way of doing it. Now, one thing I'll mention is that cleanup is important. I'm sure my wife would agree with that statement. And with VBA, almost all of our cleanup is automatic. When nothing references the object, it's cleaned up. However, in this case, we've actually coded a bit of a circular reference because our form, our calendar form, has a collection of date displays, and our date display has a reference to the form parent. Now, each of these controls, classes, objects has a counter that is not something we coded, it's coded into VBA, has a counter that registers how many objects have a reference to it. And if we reach a point where nothing is referencing me, then I can clean myself up because no one is using me anymore. But I haven't added any cleanup code, and that might give me trouble. Let's see if I try to look at the DateDimension. I try to look at the design view of DateDimension, and you get, this text box or message box I'm sure you've seen before. Something is using the DateDimension. Like, what? Nothing's using the DateDimension anymore. The reason for that, and you can see if I go and break my code, reset, clear all variables, now I can open my DateDimension. But if I open my calendar, I close it again, I'm back to not being able to open my DateDimension. So I'll go into design, I'll just hit stop. And what I'll say is that whenever my calendar is closing, so I'll do the form unload, and I'll say, well, set date displays my collection of dates to nothing. So this should clean up because all of the other objects should clean up on their own now. But we can verify if I use my calendar, close it. Can I now open my design view for the DateDimension? I can. So I've cleaned up my references. And one of the things I usually do if I'm coding classes for the first time is that for each class, I'll go into the class, I'll go down to the two built-in methods of the class, is the initialize and the terminate. I'll go and the terminate, and I'll do a debug.print closing, because then I can verify, is my class actually terminating as I expect it to? And if I don't see my debug.print coming out in my immediate pane, that's because there's some cleanup that's not working as intended. Could talk more about inheritance and interfaces. That's more of a really advanced class, and that won't be covered today. And I guess that's all I had for this presentation. Any questions?
Just before I pass over to the questions, thank you very much, Anders, for the way you built that up and developed the concepts beautifully, and even you managed to briefly lose yourself there, but you rescued yourself very quickly. The typical live demonstration there. So well done, you. There was really, I think, only one question during the session in the chat that led to a long exchange that I couldn't keep up with. So I don't know, Neil, does your question need to be further discussed? His question was, so
I'm not sure because it's still being debated.
Yeah, right. So
Shall I clarify exactly what I said, because there's some confusion I was referring to. In the parent form, declared two public events, one for the mouse move and one for the date change. And I questioned whether they needed to be public because the children text boxes could see those events anyway because they were children, was my question. Am I right in saying that we could have monitored those from the class even if they were private? But then later in the demonstration, he showed that he was using those as public events because he was using other forms to look at them to monitor it for another reason.
Yeah, so the final class date display, or sorry, the final calendar had a public event for date selected. Up here in the calendar, the one I coded on the screen, I only had the mouth change and mouse over, and they are not being used from other forms, but they do need to be public. The child might be a child, but it still needs to be public to access it.
Okay. That was really the essence of the question. Would they still be visible?
They wouldn't, no.
Okay, thank you.
Right, there was a long discussion about let and set. Ade, you were involved in that from the start. Do you want to contribute there?
Yes, I think someone was saying that there were situations where whether you use the property set or property let was interchangeable. And I was suggesting that that wasn't the case, and that if you have an object, it must always use set, as it would with ordinary code. And if you have a non-object variable, like a long or blah, 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 it would always be let and it couldn't be set.
That is correct. You use set for objects and you use let for simple variables.
Indeed.
There were about a dozen people got involved in that long exchange. Does anyone else who was involved, or even if you weren't, that you think you've got something else to add to that, please would you turn your microphone on? If so, and I will call on you. Right, I'm going to ask a really simple question. There was a month change event, for want of the right phrase. There's no year change event. Was that when the year changes, it automatically involves a month change? Is that right, Anders?
That's a very good question. Let's take
I think he left that bit out, I'm afraid, Colin.
We'll find out. And while you're looking for that, Tim Jacoby asked about the table month as well.
Yeah, so I don't have anything in this. Let's see if I actually cover it in the final. Yeah. So the final one does have that extra bit of
code, right?
Sugar or perfection.
Yeah, so it wasn't automatic, it's a separate bit of code. Fair enough. Tim Jacoby asked how you generated all the data in table month. And if I said, do something for 2070, have you got the dates for some ridiculous number of years?
Within the, am I still sharing my screen?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So within the Access database, and you'll get this full Access database, feel free to play around with it. There's a set date pop, which is used to create and populate the date dimension. So you can adjust this as you please.
Thank you. Domenico.
Different question, and maybe a simple one. When it comes to events on controls, we know there's a certain hierarchy that they'll execute if you happen to have multiples. But in reference to the raise event, and you had the calendar raising the event, and then you had two other forms acting on it. Is there a hierarchy that says which one's going to fire first? And obviously, I think the second part to my question is if one of them had an error to debugs, it's probably going to stop on that and not continue on the other form. But just on the notion of that raised event triggering subsequent actions by the two other forms, is there just an arbitrary, it just randomly picks which one's going to go first, or is there some logic behind deciding who gets to go first?
That is a good question. I'm sure there's logic behind it. I have absolutely no idea what it is. But let's try. I've just put a message box into both the production and the sales. Final calendar open. So I open the production first and then the sales. And if we do here, change the date. So the production seemed to respond first. See if I open them in reverse order. Sales and production. See if that modifies how they react to the event. So the sales responded first in this case, so maybe because that was registering as listener first, or maybe it's just, I don't know. Let's try to also go into the form sales. Let's do a divide by 0 error. Close, 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 just to make sure we have a blank slate. Final, we open, let's just open the production, open the sales, and let's try to change the date. So the production fired, the sales fire, sales errors. Now, since I don't handle that error, if I say end, that's the same as hitting the reset. I'm resetting all of my code. Now, I mean, nothing is happening anymore, right? All of these events, all of these classes, they're not firing anymore because they were set up in code.
And I guess.
So yeah, if you have unhandled errors, then all sorts of crap can happen. I never seem to be able to type when someone is watching my screen. So let's try to handle it just a wee bit and giving the error message. Open production, sales, change the date, production fires, sales fires, we get our error. But the events are still tied up now because I handled the error instead of just allowing VBA to die on me. So if you do have your error handling, then it can continue. Let's see if we do it in reverse of having the sales fire first. So we have sales, we have production. Now when I change the event, sales will fire first, we'll get our error, and then production will continue to fire. So as long as you have your proper error handling, then you can see that the production wasn't affected by the fact that there was an error in the sales. Did that answer your question?
It does. Thank you very much. And what I really liked about the embedded option of it is that you don't have to worry then about trying to have the one form go to the parent down to the sub form to set up something. It's just, naturally just listens. You don't have to worry about relationships and anything else along those lines. So I found this to be very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think all of us have found it very interesting. And some of us saw it originally. Steve Gerling also saw it in Oxford and again says he appreciates it just as much, if not more, the second time round. There was a discussion about whether or not using a date table would work with this sort of code. Have you tried doing it without date table, just generating the dates on the fly, which is what I do in mine? And your comments on that?
Yeah, so when I was setting up this, I mean, I created the calendar form just for this presentation. And the quickest way for me at that time was using just a date table. But as I said earlier, we also do a lot of stuff in Excel, and I don't have the date table in Excel. So when I created the same form in Excel, I set it up using just code, and no date table. That being said, if you want to have, I mean, if you're just looking at weekends, stuff like that, that's simple enough. You can, color Saturday and Sunday to be a different color, so you don't accidentally select those days for a meeting. But if you have holidays as well, that's one of the things where a date calendar can really, shine. and setting up if today is a holiday, then color that. I don't know, same as weekend. And if you have something like fiscal years that don't cover the full year, then fiscal years having that in a date table is also really great.
Okay,
Especially
thanks.
if you have SQL Server, you can do. I've tried to do some performance testing of having a date table in Access versus calculating a lot of the stuff, and I didn't see that much of a difference. But when you're doing it in SQL Server, especially if you want to group by something like a month or filter by a month using indexes, having a date table can be like 100 times better performance.
Yeah, good point. Skimming through, and if I've missed somebody, please come back to me. Jim F., why was it necessary to open the calendar form before the production and sales forms?
Why? Because it's a good question.
It's been answered. Sorry, it's actually been answered by somebody else.
Okay.
The listening object must have a variable declared with events.
Yeah, and I don't want. I mean, I could have code in the calendar, but I specifically don't want to have code in my calendar that says, well, if some other form is open, like the production, then go to the production and ask that to set up the events. I mean, so you can always argue whether this is practical way to do it. This is just for demo purposes of setting it up.
Lovely. Okay, thank you. So you're going to provide this database, which includes the presentation. And if you can email that to me, Anders, I will then put it on the website. Have we covered everything that needed to be covered? Somebody said about things like school holidays and so on as well, which is, again, a good point. Thank you, Olaf. Right. Anders, thank you ever so much for agreeing to give this talk to us. And as I said, I appreciate it a lot. I do use classes, not as regularly as some of the others here, but reinforcement of knowledge is always useful. For those that haven't used classes at all or have been scared by them, I think you've made life a lot easier for them to feel confident in doing that. And it's an excellent example as well. Right, so thank you again from me and from all the others. There's a lot of very positive comments, which you can see on the screen there. And if you're happy, I'm going to take over the screen now and introduce our next month's superstar. And from a former MVP who gave up voluntarily a couple of years ago, we go to I'm going to call him this on purpose, a veteran MVP in the sense that he has been an MVP for now 27 years. And the title was deliberately enigmatic. Update the companies in a state. Karl Donaubauer. Messed it up. Right. He's going to talk to you about next month's presentation, which will be on the 7th of May. Karl, do you need to share your screen?
Not really. I mean, we could show the details from next month, but I prepared a 2-minute elevator pitch. I think that will do it. Well, I will explain Microsoft updates and update bugs. It starts with the update frequency and the right channel. In healthcare, we call this prevention. When there's a new problem with Access, everyone immediately cries, yeah, that's a new bug, that's an update bug, and Microsoft, and I leave out the swear words here, but you should test this in a structured way, discuss it with others, and get information from the right place. Otherwise, the diagnosis is worth nothing. If you're really affected by an update bug, there are things you can do to keep the application running, and I will tell you about it. Workarounds or emergency medicine, as we call it. You can even help Microsoft to release a fix more quickly, and I will tell how. I will also show demos of how to change channels, roll back versions, etc. However, the most important thing is to provide and to get the right information so that you are not left in the dark. The 2 things you will take away: number 1, information and the right resources on these topics. And number 2, a planned and structured procedure for dealing with updates and when you are affected by an update bug. This will help yourself and make a good impression on users or customers, so that you don't just run around crying and cursing like a frightened chicken, because that's the impression many people give in forums, etc. when it comes to heavy update bugs. That's it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Karl. And you're not going to go yet, though, because you've got to talk about next week's Devcon. Have you still got any spaces for people to join you?
Yes, we are at about 115 attendees right now. And
yeah, you see the agenda here. If there's something interesting for you, sign up.
And there are a lot of good speakers, and there's me as well. But it will be an excellent event. You'll hear from the Access team about what they're planning for the next 6 months. Karl doing his community update. I'm talking about modern charts. Maria Barnes and other MVPs talking about one of the ways of dealing with the imminent demise of classic Outlook and automation, and so on and so on.
And
So
new
there's a lot
Outlook
there.
is a point here. Also at number 5, we are trying to overcome new Outlook with Power Automate. That's a new innovative way for Access people.
Do me a favor, pronounce the presenter's name for me, because I've always had problems with NT.
Hätte Jan können das machen.
Well, I've got that. Yeah, right. Okay, lovely. Thank you. Mike Wolf doing 2 short presentations. Think about VCS add-ins and so on and so on. So a lot there that is good. And Juan Soto will no doubt mention ice cream at least once in his presentation number 11 there as well. So there's still time, and you can book a place on that. Please do. We need more people to join us. Right. Okay.
Very quickly, someone's put a question in, Alexandra, for Carl's event that he was just talking about. That is accessible remotely. I think it's only remote, isn't it, Karl?
Yes, it's in Microsoft Teams remote.
All right. So it's next Thursday and Friday of next week, and anyone who does actually pay the registration fee will be able to watch all of the sessions after the event, rather than having to sit through 2 full days if you can't actually give up the time at once there. And a small number of presentations are normally also made available publicly. I expect Karl will do the same this year as well, but not all of them. Right. If there's no other questions, then in a minute I'm going to bring the meeting to a close. And again, thank Anders for this month's presentation, and Karl for telling us about next month's. And hopefully there'll be no major Access or Windows bugs before then. And hopefully that Karl telling you all about it will bring an end to them. But that would be something I think which is never going to happen. Thank you all for attending, and I will see you all next month. Cheers.